there was a real lack of surrender. For me, it was more about, hey, I want fire insurance, eternal fire insurance, but I'm not so sure about this, being committed and under the authority of God.
Sitting in a married class, but I'm a single man after 8 years of marriage.
Nearly every adult is running around, walking around, going through life, doing work, maybe excelling in business or ministry, and yet they're a 40-year-old biologically, they're a 50, 60, 70-year-old biologically, and they're still 8, 10, 12 emotionally.
Helping men to understand that God is their father and that sometimes they grow up thinking that God is like their human father. And so they see God through that grid or that screen, and they miss all that God is for them.
This is the thing we can't stand usually, is there are things that God requires community to do
Yes.
for us that he won't do for us and that we can't do for ourselves. And we hate that because that feels the most vulnerable.
It's amazing what happens when you get somebody away from their everyday work. They break down, they talk, and you can really make some spiritual growth.
Where young men especially, where boys and young men are pushed more and more to be feminized versions of boys or men, and in a culture that doesn't value or promote or strengthen the good aspects of what masculine strength and characteristics even look like.
Loving to work with men and enjoying the fact that when you sit across from a man and you're working with him to help him grow his life, there's nothing better. Just looking across and seeing God change his life is incredible.
Well, hey, friends, welcome to our Love and Truth Network podcast. I'm so excited for you to be here with us to hear from my friend Richard. And whether you're tuning in from Love and Truth Network or through Transforming Congregations, we are excited that you're here, whether you're watching, whether you're listening to the program. And we hope that this will be something that is really encouraging for you, gives you some insight, and maybe even gives some directions. Our conversation after hearing Richard share about some of his own story of coming to faith, which, of course, if you've been following us at all, you know that that's how we begin all of our podcasts. But our conversation is really going to center around ministry to men. And I'm excited for Richard to be here and to share. He has such a heart for this area of ministry. It's kind of his wheelhouse of passion in the church. And so we're blessed to have you with us, Richard. And also, let me just mention that the way Richard and I connected was through a ministry called Pinnacle Forum, where different leaders from around the country, these groups are national, maybe even perhaps international, I'm not sure, but the Pinnacle Forum groups are national, and it's a gathering not just for men, it's for men and for women, but probably the vast majority of these would be leaders who are men who come together, whether it's in the morning or an afternoon or an evening, but come together most of the time on a Zoom or some kind of a video a platform where we can talk together, share together, and just have a accountability and friendship, and really spur one another on, as Paul writes about spurring one another on to love and good deeds. And so we want to be about that as well. And that's where I met Richard and heard his heart for men's ministry to men. And that's where I just had this idea. I'd love to have you on a podcast for Love and Truth Network and Transforming Congregations. So again, Richard, with that long, ongoing kind of introduction, thank you so much for being with us and joining us.
I'm glad to be here with you, Gary.
That's great. I appreciate that. As I mentioned to you prior and then in the introduction, we really love to just hear how God has moved in various people's lives and have drawn them into faith. And so, and our podcast is a pretty open book. And so anything that you feel comfortable sharing with our audience and just letting them know about how God has met you and intervened, we'd love to kind of hear that story of the before and the during, the meeting Jesus, and the after a little bit.
Well, that's great to share your testimony. And I come from a Christian home. I would think it's my dad was a Baptist minister, but it wasn't until I was 15 in a revival meeting and sitting in the back of the church that I really recognized that hell was a possibility for me if I didn't make a choice for Christ. And that wasn't the only reason, but obviously I walked down that aisle and my youth pastor was there and he was saying, well, you're saved already. I said, listen, Kyle, I really don't have anything nailed down. And I need you to go back I need you to take me back into your office and let's talk and let's make it permanent. Because I wanted to have something was clear in my mind that I could start my testimony with. And so he did that, and we went through the Romans road, as they call it. And then I accepted Christ as my personal Savior. And then shortly after that, I was baptized in the church. And my sister went through a similar situation, and we just wanted clarity. And so that was when I was 15. At 16, I dedicated my life to Christ for full-time ministry. Little did I know what that would really mean in the future for me. So, but I did that, and then went to Bible college, went to a seminary, and then I taught. To finish up my seminary, I went to Liberty University, and so I taught there in the religion division for 5 years, and then
right out of graduation.
Well, I was a youth pastor for a while after I went to Bible college, and then went to seminary. The seminary I initiated in, they didn't do well. After 2 years, I walked away from that, went and was a youth pastor for my father for a little bit of time. Then I joined a group that was an evangelistic group that did high school assemblies, and they also did 1 week services, every night at a church. So we did that for a couple of weeks. I met my wife there, and we got married, and then in the fall of 1975, I went to Liberty University, which was pretty new at that time. Didn't have any paved roads. It was all dirt roads to the campus, and started teaching in the religion division. So that was a great experience. And then God took us from there into a youth ministry that was going to be international. They already had people in South Korea and had people in Australia. And so we flew to Australia for the summer of 1980 and built what would be the foundation for Bible college there and training in youth ministry. And then when we came back from that, we were in Dallas area, and my wife had an affair. We tried to work it out. It didn't work out. She wanted to leave. And so I was left in 1983 in Dallas with all those dreams of ministry and stepping aside. I stepped aside for over about 10 years. She got married within a couple months after we had separated. And then I started to work with singles and be a part of that. And God blessed in that ministry with singles. And I went to a church called Schofield Memorial Church, which everybody might have had a Schofield Bible a long time ago, but this is the original builder of that church was R.C. Schofield. It's a great church, and I connected there with a number of people. And then I said, I'm sitting in a married class, but I'm a single man after 8 years of marriage. And I said, hey, I'm sure there are other people that are single, whether they're divorced or never married or whatever their situation is. Maybe we could start a ministry. And that's where we began the first singles ministry that church had. When I left there after 4 years, a guy from Dallas Theological Seminary was part-time singles minister, and then another guy after him was full-time singles ministry. So I believe I kind of helped that on. And then in 1988, God began to speak to me and say, you've done everything I asked you to do. You've gone to divorce recovery. You've stayed clean in your heart and your actions. And so now I asked him, I said, God, I'd like to have a wife. I just would like to be remarried. And that was on November 1st. And a gal who had been in the same evangelistic ministry 15 years prior, I discipled her husband. They had been married for 14 years, and he stepped away. He was unfaithful in almost all of that time. And so they finally divorced. She went back to live with her parents with her 3 girls. And she said, I know that Richard has been divorced. I'm really having a hard time. I need some help. So she sent me a note. This is 1988. She sent me a note. There was no email or anything like that. And I got the note on the 15th. And I had made a list of what I wanted out of a wife. And she matched it all up. We already knew each other. We knew each other's families and their brothers and sisters. So we got married in 1989, and that started the 35 years, which is now, our anniversary was February 3rd. And
congratulations.
Thank you. It's quite a feat. So after a year of that, and I decided to go back into ministry, or felt the call to go back into ministry, singles ministry in particular. So I sent out 34 surveys, or 34 what is it called? I can't even think of the name of it. 34 resumes. And a guy who I had met in Los Angeles, who was kind of a coordinator for a convention or a certain denomination. He and I had become friends, and he had known who my father was in ministry. So I sent him a resume, and he had it sitting on his desk for 2 weeks. And his mentor called him, who was in Oregon, and this guy's in LA, called him and said, "Do you know of anybody who wants to be a singles minister?" And he said, "I got this guy on my desk. I'll send it to you." So I was one of the 17 that applied for that position in the church outside of Portland proper in Beaverton. And it went down to 3, and then I was the one who was chosen and started ministry there in January 7th, 1991, and built a college group, a middle singles group, and an older singles group, or as they would say, the mature singles group. And we had great ministry there, and also began to work with men and creating a discipleship program for those who are in singles, and getting people who are trained in discipling people. And that all started that process of loving to work with men and enjoying the fact that when you sit across from a man and you're working with him to help him grow his life, there's nothing better. You can't build a house that's more beautiful. You can't build a boat that's more beautiful. Just looking across and seeing God change his life is incredible.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, that's awesome. And how long of a stretch did you have in that church as was it singles pastor?
Well, I started as a singles pastor, then they made me the adult pastor, and then they made me the small groups pastor. This was because they were changing senior pastors every 4 years, and they all had different dreams. But I continued to work with men through that same 16 years that I was there.
Okay.
And since then,
and then what?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And since then, I spent time in business with my son in real estate, but my heart has always been for men. I've learned how to coach men, and I have a specific coaching system that I use for men to change their life. And I've coached individually 75 men and trained about 39 men in the coaching process, so they can do the same thing.
Okay, awesome. And going back to your story a little bit, I want to pick up on men's ministry. I also want to talk with you a little bit about your experience with singles ministry and just the needs of singles in general. Obviously, not just men, but going back to your story a little bit. So I'm reminded of the reality. You grew up as a Baptist pastor's son, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and I didn't grow up as a pastor's kid, but I grew up in a Baptist church and had similar experience. Once you say the prayer and you're done. I mean, once you're saved, always saved, and
Yeah,
if you've put the right words together, then there shouldn't be any like questioning of our faith or what have you. But
right.
I went through a similar experience because I knew that even though I had managed to kind of eke out the right words and go through the Romans road as well, and there was a part of me that really, obviously wanted salvation, there was also, for me, there was a real lack of surrender and a real kind of withholding or not trusting God. And so for me, it was more about, hey, I want fire insurance, eternal fire insurance, but I'm not so sure about this, being committed and under the authority of God and that kind
Right.
of thing. So it wasn't until I was 23 that I actually really gave and had gone through a whole bunch of craziness. Um, but at 23, really surrendered my life to Christ for real. But anyway, had a similar church background and
Hmm.
probably theological background as well. Do you still? How would you say your father? And this not so much just a reflection on your father, but even as a pastor of a Baptist church, a more conservative church, uh, uh, his generation. How do you feel um, that he represented what a boy needs from his dad? Speaking of men, of ministry to men, do you
Yeah.
feel like he was equipped to really give you all that you needed as a boy, and gave that out sufficiently, or was it more difficult to kind of understand what kids needed back then, boys in particular?
Well, I would say that I misunderstood a lot of what he did because basically he was a pastor who'd come to dinner and he would eat with us as a family, and then he'd go back and study more. So we really didn't spend that much time together. And I would say he was a good father, provided for us in all the ways he needed to. But um, I was in Tennyson High School, went to state in high school, and he never saw me do any of that. And so I would say he wasn't a good role model for me, and I determined that I wouldn't be like that. But later on, I found out that he was born in Saskatchewan, Canada. His mother was more Pentecostal, but his dad was refusing to do any of that. And so his dad left them, he and his brother and his mother, when my dad was 14. So he just left. He abandoned them. So my dad had to step out of high school, become a meat cutter, and pay the bills for the family. So he didn't really have a father that cared for him. Okay, I can tell you now that when we moved from Arizona to Colorado, my dad took a church in Denver, and that's where I planned my salvation. That his father, he invited him to come live with us, and he did accept Christ as a savior before he died. But he had limited amount of good experiences to what a father really is.
Sure.
So I have to
Do
take
you
that
think
into
some of
consideration. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and that's helpful to know. Do you feel like some of what motivates you to to be involved or have a passion around ministry to men, does some of that flow out of the gaps of
Yeah.
and the recognition of the gaps of what you didn't get, even though you grew up in a Christian home, and
Right.
not only just a Christian home, but a home with a Christian leader, a pastor?
Right. And that even goes to the fact that just recently I've created this legacy for leaving a legacy, just a
Yeah.
four-page understanding of that, and I've been using it in several small groups that I'm a part of. I'm using it with my sons at the moment. We will
Hmm.
finish it next week because I determined that I needed to be with them every week as in a Zoom call. And God
Yeah.
took me to Texas for a reason, and so many things happened out of that in a small group and when we began, it was a large church, but a small group, and the leader was a detective in the Dallas Police Department. And
Hmm.
after we did our small group study and everything, he pulled me over to the side and said, "Hey, I figured out this neat thing that I'm doing for my children." He says, "They all kind of live away from me. So I read the Bible every day and I look for a verse and then I send it to them." And I had been praying, "Okay, God, I've moved away from the three girls that are part of our family and from our boy that we had together as after we were in the second marriage. And I'm moving back to my first son. So how am I going to spiritually influence their lives? The challenge that is." And this guy comes up and says, "I just send a Bible verse every day." And I said, "Okay, Lord, are you talking to me?" So I created what is called Today's Word. I wrote it out of my readings of the Bible. There were there are 1,485 Today's Words that cover 6.5 years. And I sent that to them. Plus, I also had about 100 other people that wanted it. So I had a small group, and then I would study, then take something from what I studied and send it to them, thinking that was a way for them to be encouraged spiritually, and a way for me to still connect,
Yeah.
even though I was far
Did
away.
did you regarding today's word, is that something that you authored?
Yes,
Okay.
it's
Okay.
well, the words Today's Word. I looked it up, so I think it's privatized to mine. I have them
Yeah.
all done over those
Okay.
years, and
By the way, how many books have you written or curricula?
well, that's an interesting thing because I had not written anything until I had those Today's Words, and then I was listening to John Maxwell, who said, I only write in 4 areas," and he said one of them is leadership, and there was 3 others, pastoral and all that. But uh, I thought to myself, I wondered over all those 6.5 years if there's something I missed that God designed in those 1,485 Today's Words. So I went back, and that became the basis of my first book, which is called A Living a Principled Life. And I have 80 universal principles that come from the Bible in 4 categories. Principles related to character, principles related to conduct, principles related to confidence, like love, joy, peace, confident things, and then 23 principles to tie it all up that are related to community. They were all sitting there, and I'd written on them, and I just shined them up and cleaned them up, and that book was published in late December of 22,
Okay.
2022.
Awesome.
And I had
Um,
to put on the front of it volume 1
ah,
to
yes, you
force
might have
me
a
to
couple
do
more
write
coming.
volume 2. And volume 2 is about the 43 negative principles that when you are involved with them, they will destroy your life.
Okay.
Pride, hate, anger, and all those. And so that's
Okay.
the volume 2.
Yep. Well, and you've been kind of, I feel like at times from our conversations in Pinnacle Forum, and when people ask, when I'm asked in the group, kind of what's going on with me, or I'm not even sure that I don't remember now if I've been in a few groups where I've shared my testimony and that kind of thing, but it's been maybe a little bit of a baptism by fire for you and the rest of the group to kind of get to know me and my background and what the Lord has brought me out of and that kind of thing. And so I'm just wondering, in dealing in sexuality, and obviously that's not just a men's issue, to be sure. I mean, it's increasingly a women's issue, even when it comes to pornography and things of that nature, adultery, fornication, obviously. But certainly sexuality seems to be something that, or oftentimes the misuse of sexuality seems to be something that tends to drive guys, young guys, even older
Yeah.
guys, more on a percentage basis more than women. But in the writings that you're doing and in the discipleship work you do, I'm just wondering, do you incorporate some of those ideas or principles of the positive aspects of God's design for our sexuality and our identity as male and female made in His image, as well as then, like you're talking about the second book, talking about the things that can destroy you, the negative sides? Or do you bring out much of that in your writings or in your discipleship work?
We do. We have 7 assessments that we've created that have short statements on them, and then a 1 to 5 ratio. 1 to 5, that they can grade themselves. I'm not a mentor. I don't want to be a mentor because that kind of means I'm above them. So I work with them, and we go through these I call them assessments. And the first one is loves God the Father. And we talk immensely about how he is a father, how we're adopted, and all of that. And then we have these statements, and they have to grade themselves on that as they feel. Are they a 2, a 5? And then we talk about why did you grade yourself as a 3? Well, this, and then we can get into conversation. So it takes us usually 21 meetings to go over 7 assessments, because we're dealing with 6 to 8 statements on each one. They're grading themselves, and we do get into the moral areas of their money, and also the sexuality, and how they deal with the opposite sex. And so we talk about those things because they're brought up as a statement. Where would you be on this scale? So we get a little look. I'm taking down their whatever they say, if it's a 3, a 5, and then we write notes down there. But at the bottom of every one of these, loves God, committed to the Lordship of Christ, submissive to the Spirit, then 4 other kind of areas that I think are crucial to discipleship to finish it out. But we spend most of our time, and interestingly enough, I'm reading a book called How People Grow by Cloud and Townsend.
Yeah.
And in that, he makes reference to the fact that you really have to have an understanding of some doctrine if you're going to grow in your spiritual life. And that was just another emphasis that we believed that a long time ago, and we put it into these assessments, and helping men to understand that God is their father, and that sometimes they grow up thinking that God is like their human father. And so they see God through that grid or that screen, and they miss all that God is for them. So what we talk about doing is raising your eyes above your father, who was I say this about my father, he was a sinful person. He was just a normal human being. So raising my eyes above him rather than going through him and saying, well, he ignored me, therefore God ignores me. Or he didn't say that he loved me. The first time I put my arms around my father was when I was 45 years old. So it's been a long process to come back together. So men have to understand that their Heavenly Father is loving and caring and adopted, and what all that means to them. And that helps them to move forward. No matter what the situation is with their father, obviously there can be terrible situations, but God can heal that in their hearts. No matter how long it takes, he can do that. So yeah, we want men to lead, and they need to spiritually, emotionally, mentally grow. And this is the way we do it. At the end of each assessment, we say, on the basis of what you've learned about yourself, where would you like to grow further? And so we give them a chance to put something down there, and then we go to the next assessment. Then after the 7 assessments are done, then we have a summary assessment, which says, okay, write down what you put at the bottom of all those pages. And then let's say, okay, you got 5 different things you want to grow in, or 7, depending on how intricate you were on it. But then you say, okay, which one do you want to start with? So we have we have a trinity going on. I'm helping them, the Spirit's helping me, the Spirit's helping them, and then they're connecting with me. So it's really up to the Spirit to change them, and not me. But I need to get them to open up, and that's why I use the 7 assessments.
That's great. I love that. Yeah, there's a number of things kind of firing off in my brain, but one thing you mentioned a moment ago is that you're helping in the areas of spirituality and intellect, and you mentioned emotions too, in the emotional. And I think that for men is one of the most neglected areas of trying to help them become healthy. Spiritually, they get a lot of kind of spiritual perspective, preaching, dialogue in church, and then hopefully if they're in a regular rhythm of reading the scriptures, they're getting some spiritual connection there. And of course, that's about so much more than just spiritual. But I so often, and then there's the intellectual, obviously,
Yeah.
education, and so many. What I found, to put it simply, what I found is that nearly every man, frankly, nearly every woman, unless they've done a lot of work as adults to grow in their emotional capacity and health, what I find is that nearly every adult is running around, walking around, going through life, doing work, maybe excelling in business or ministry, and yet they're a 40-year-old biologically, they're a 50,
Yeah.
60, 70-year-old biologically, and they're still 8, 10, 12 emotionally.
Right. Right.
What would you say about that specifically with regard to men,
Well, there
the
is a
emotional
good book that
side?
that I recommend, and that's by a pastor from New York. It's Scazzaro. I
Oh,
think
Peter
it's
Scazzaro, yes.
Peter Scazzaro wrote Emotionally Healthy Spirituality.
Yes.
And the connection there is really important because I don't think you grow unless you get out of your teen years mentally and emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no desire to do that, and you're driving the big truck, or you're doing whatever that makes you feel like a man, but you're still acting like a kid.
Right.
So I would say that's the hardest area for a man to work in is his emotions,
Yeah.
because he's been told to shut up and don't cry all his life, and now
Yes.
you're saying, I'm not trying to make him into a woman. I'm saying you got to connect with your heart.
Right.
And we have three different areas of focus in us. We have a mind that can think, and an intellect and all of that. We have a heart that's our soul, and where we can emote. And then we have a gut, which tells us things much sooner than any of the others do about
Mm,
other people. And those three things, when they all are working together, I think you're becoming more emotionally healthy.
yes. Right, exactly. And you mentioned a little bit ago about the idea of this kind of triangle effect that's happening as you're working with a man, maybe a young man, maybe a peer, whatever. That there's the dynamic of of you ministering, of God, obviously God, the Holy Spirit ministering to you, giving you insight, the Holy Spirit giving them insight, and ultimately, as you said, rightly so, He's the only one that can bring about genuine change in that person's life. But then there's also this connection between that person and you,
Yeah,
where which is forming this triangle. And I often talk about, when I'm out teaching and speaking, I talk about the fact that there are things that only God can do for us that we can't do for ourselves. And there are things that we can do for ourselves that God refuses to do for us, because He wants us to do that. I mean, empowered by Him, but He wants us
yeah,
to take up some authority, to take action. But then there's also, and this is the thing we can't stand usually, is there are things that God requires community to do
yeah.
for us that He won't do for us, and that we can't do for ourselves. And we hate that, because that feels the most vulnerable. We need to open up to community. That's part of God's design for us. And yet sin, particularly sexual sin, tends to have so much shame, just laden with shame. And when we're feeling that shame, the last thing we want to do is open up to community. And yet that is really what completes that triangle, that healthy place, is when we're connected with God, we're connected with ourselves, even in a way that is, we understand ourselves, we know ourselves, we're working through issues and growing and maturing, but we're also deeply connecting with other brothers, sisters, yes, but more importantly, and our spouse for sure, our a wife if we're married as men. But also we need our brothers that are part of our community as well. And I think that isn't, while that's while there's some talk about that, and there's some recognition in men's groups that that's good. I've been to so many men's groups that just scratch the surface or only address the intellectual or the spiritual side and leave the emotional completely unaddressed. I'm assuming you probably have experienced that too.
Yes, and I really recommend everybody that's interested in men's ministries, pastors especially, to read the book "Why Men Hate to Go to Church"
Yeah.
by David Morrow, and
Mm-hmm.
he just makes it so evident that we have become so laden to be. Uh, all the Sunday school teachers are women. All the teachers in the education system are women, so we get kind of lulled to sleep, and boys mature 1 to 2 years later than girls do. So there's a
Right.
lot of stuff going on there, and so there's some real power in having accountability. And another friend of both of ours, Marsh uh, Bull, has a
Mm-hmm.
mensgroup.com or mensgroup.org, uh, men's place where people can get studies. And I just wrote a study, and it's there on the extended studies.
Okay.
It's a 4-lesson study on accountability. Why do you
Mm.
need it? What do you do? And because when I was 41 and went to that church in Beaverton, after about a month of being there, the pastor took me in his office and said, "Okay, Richard, I'm going to give you 2 weeks to find accountability partner." Okay, now this was my response. What's accountability group? What's an accountability partner?
Right.
Okay, I had been to Bible college. I had been to seminary.
Yep.
No one had ever talked about it. I've
Mm-hmm.
been in church work. And so he says it's getting someone who you give them 4 to 5 to 6 questions that you want asked of them from them every time you meet. You have to meet every other week. And so I found a great friend, and David and I met for a number of years. And then when he was left,
Mm-hmm.
I found another accountability partner, and I would write on a small sheet of paper, these 5 questions I want you to ask me. And it was the greatest thing in the world to know that I'm eating lunch with this person, and we get to talk about me, and they would ask me penetrating questions, and then at the end, he would say, now, "You asked me to do this, so I'm going to do it." And he'd pull out his wallet
Mm-hmm.
and take out those 5 questions and ask me. And
Yep.
he said to me, and you have agreed to tell the truth.
Right.
Okay. So that is accountability is so powerful and so needed for men. And that can flow out of a small group. Individually, I think it's best done one-on-one. And
Yep.
then uh, you can have the group for support and encouragement. So
Mm-hmm.
there are so many
Yeah.
things that can be done with men, but most pastors, and I apologize to any pastors listening to this, but most pastors, it seems like the only 2 things they're interested in is you become a number and you're at the church and you're attending and you give a check. Outside of those 2 things, most pastors would say, "Well, I'm a man, so I can do men's ministry." No, you can't, because you're not that focused. You have to lead the church, and that doesn't necessarily mean you can spend all your time with men. So it has to be a focused ministry, and I keep asking the question, if you pay a women's minister, why don't you pay a men's ministry person?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like that's what should be doing, discipleship. And you're going to talk about men's ministry, and I have 4 different sections of the pie. We can do that whenever you're ready.
Oh no, I think that I'd love to dive in there. I have, from my experience, and I was you've been a pastor. I was a pastor for 12 years as well, and I know so many wonderful pastors, many of them that are doing amazing work. Some of it in the men's ministry space,
Yeah.
and and I often, what I feel like from my experience with pastors and and having kind of traveled around the country and gone to a number of churches, is certainly I do believe that in the arena of sexual brokenness and restoring sexual wholeness, and even in these issues of identity. I mean, that's why our ministry exists, because I believe the church ultimately has the answers. They're God's plan A, whether not just on these issues of sexuality and identity, but certainly there, and more broadly speaking. And that's also true for sure of men's ministry, women's ministry as well, ministry to women, ministry to men. But what I find is that so often pastors are just inundated and kind of devoured by the pace of ministry or the pace of what ministry can be. In some ways, ministry almost loses its genuine ministry because it becomes like a machine. And I know that I certainly experienced this as well, that you can just get gobbled up and devoured by that. And I think there's so many well-meaning and well-intentioned pastors and leaders who want to do a good job. I mean, most are not in the role for ulterior motives. They're there because they want to shepherd and they want to do it well. And yet there's a big kind of missing of the mark because of a lack of training, a lack of equipping, a lack of maybe gifting in that area. And ultimately, to me, it comes back to the reality. I think that I firmly believe that pastors and the pastors are in place, leaders are in place for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. And too often, and it's impossible for pastors to do it all. And yet I think that the vast majority of folks that are attending church are, I mean, what's the kind of well-known statistic that, 80% of the people attending church are just sitting as spectators, and 20% or it's 90% and 10% are doing all the work. And so there's, in one sense, pastors need, for sure, biblically speaking, need to be equipping for the work of ministry. And yet many times, we've either, just out of either laziness or our own busyness as Christians, we're not really wanting to be equipped for the work of ministry. We expect the pastor, like, hey, we pay you, you do all of this. And yet that takes us completely outside of the New Testament teachings of what the body even looks like and how we should function together. So I definitely think that has an impact in men's ministry. One of the things that you mentioned just reminded me that the church that Melissa and I and our family attend here in the Phoenix area is a very, very large church. And, that church was founded, I don't know, now maybe 35 years ago. And Don Wilson was the original founder of that. And his heart I don't know if it was from the very beginning, but early on, he recognized that, look, if we build our churches and our ministries oriented toward men, that the percentages show that when a man comes to Christ, or a man surrenders his life, or a man recommits or whatever his life to Christ, that the 90% of the time, the children and their wife, their family comes along in that decision, and yet the percentages really drop when you're focused primarily on women, or when you're focused on children. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on women and children, obviously. But the church that we now attend, I mean, there's I think 16 different campuses in the Phoenix area, and it's grown to like 45,000 people, which sounds crazy, but the way that they and they're always talking about the backbone of their church is small groups. I mean, that's just all there is to it. If people are not involved in a small group, they're showing up on Sundays and they're like, hey, you're here on a Sunday, but you are not in fellowship. This is not fellowship. This is not where you're going to find accountability. It's not where you're going to find genuine relationship. But even though we're a huge church, if you're in these smaller groups of 12 or 15 people, and you're doing it on a regular basis, and you're entering into genuine prayer and discussion, and really have each other's backs, and are operating accountability, then just because we're a huge church doesn't mean that you can't experience real intimacy in these groups that make up kind of the cellular structure of the whole body. So anyway, I thought it was interesting. This church has never gone through a split. And it's just continued to grow over time. It's now led by another senior pastor who is wonderful and amazing. But the fact that was originally the founder's vision of really orienting the church toward men, that is so unusual in the structure of most churches today.
Yeah, I would agree with you. There are great churches around. There's one in Arkansas where the pastor was just had like 1,200 men on a breakfast every Wednesday or whatever.
Hmm.
So there are guys that are doing it around the country. But I think our seminaries have kind of hurt us, given us all the details of
Right.
learning the languages and all of that. But they don't do anything for a pastor. He doesn't know anything about accounting. He doesn't know anything about
Right.
discipleship. It doesn't seem like,
Yeah.
because his quiver he's full. His quiver is full of arrows, and he can't take any more.
Well, and
He's
his
working.
mind is full, right? The other
Yeah,
thing that often doesn't happen in seminary is any real internal spiritual formation either. You know,
yeah,
we so many people enter into seminary with a full-blown porn addiction or some other kind of sexual
yeah,
brokenness or some other kind of serious issue of deeds of the flesh just leaking out everywhere, and they leave seminary with those same issues or
right,
worse, and then go into a ministry situation where now I really have to hide all this stuff, and so it just perpetuates this
right,
double living. And man, what a miserable place to be in a church setting and situation where you could have hopefully have been really guided, like some of the programs you're talking about, if they had those surveys and men walking alongside of them in their formation in Bible college or seminary, they could be light years ahead of where they're actually at. But now they're kind of left to themselves,
yeah,
unfortunately. And what they should choose is the hard choice. I'm going to come out of the darkness. I'm going to come into the light. I'm going to find the help that I need. That is on them to do that, but it becomes a harder and harder decision to make the longer it goes on.
right. And yeah, we're really good at hiding.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I'd love for you to talk about those four quadrants, or I'm probably saying that wrong, but what you brought up a few moments ago to kind of unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah, just in the last minutes we're together here, we just talk about a circle that's divided vertically and horizontally. So we got four pieces of the pie in ministry, and then we have a leadership group above that. So I put it in. There's a main event. There should be some big places where men can come together, that they can see that there are other believers uh, across the board, and worship together and get challenged together, and where hundreds of men can do that. That's a main event. And then there are out of that event, and for those who couldn't necessarily make those events, are clusters. I choose to call them clusters rather than small groups. I think some guys I've talked to about small groups, because I was a small group pastor for 4 years. They don't like that. Oh, small group. It sounds like I'm going back into counseling or something. So clusters of men who get together and pray together, and they study the word, and they challenge each other, and they can even break down into, there's accountability that can take place there, with everybody having an accountability partner, and it doesn't have to be shared at all with the group. So the clusters become the second element of how you work with men. And then special events, and those can go into three categories, where you're drawing unbelieving men to come just because it's going to be a great event. And we did one in Beaverton, which we called Braveheart Games. And we had a huge grassy area. We put a huge tent up. We were going to serve ribs to everybody, a full meal. Obviously, we charged them for that. But then there were 9 events that they had to participate in, and they were scored on those events. And at the end of the night, we gave the winners a ribbon with a medal on it, just like the Olympics. And they could take that back. It didn't matter whether they were believer or unbeliever. We had a guy make a set of horseshoes that was 3 feet tall and made out of steel, 2 of them. So trying to get them around that post at the end was kind of hard. And then we had throwing a lance. What's the distance? And we had a guy throwing a rock. I mean, just strange things, but everybody enjoyed it. There were people cheering and laughing, and then they go in the tent. They have a nice dinner, and then we have a word from the pastor concerning men. And that's a special event for men that can be unbelievers. And what it does is when they go to work on Monday morning, say, hey, how was your weekend? Oh man, I went to this event. We did this. I scored. Look what I got. And so it gave them a story to talk about their men's ministry. And then there are other things like missions, mission events where guys can go on and be a part of something special there. And the other section, that one, in relational events where you're doing a father-son retreat, or you're doing a hike, or you're doing a camp out. I know when I was working with singles in Virginia, we came all the way out to Colorado and did a hike over there's 4 ranges from Denver over west. And so we go over one and hike over there and do uh, rappelling and all of that. So that's kind of a special event. It's amazing what happens when you get somebody away from their everyday work. They break down, they talk, and you can really make some spiritual growth out of that. So those are areas and special events. And then the last one is coaching, which I think I've designed a program which is not a Bible study program. It's involving them in their own life and having them evaluate themselves and then move forward. And you can do that. I do it through a coaching system where I'm asking them questions. I'm not counseling them. I'm asking them questions about where they are and why they chose certain things. And the interesting thing is, that something's happened in their life when they kind of turn their head and look up and go, you know what? And then they just go on with whatever God has just told them, and they made a breakthrough. So
that's awesome. Well, and so I'm a big fan of John Eldredge. I really appreciate a lot of his writing and work with men as well. And also Gordon Dalby is somebody who is not nearly as well known as John Eldredge, but I think he actually kind of spoke into and laid out some of the framework for men's ministry that John got a hold of, and then wrote a lot of books on. But Gordon Dalby also has a number of books out on these topics. And but when I think about what you were just sharing about that event, so coming out of the LGBT world, coming out of gay identity, but then it's not just that, because even when I was on staff as a pastor and guys knew my story, I would have a lot of guys come to me and say, Garry, I don't deal with same-sex attraction, but I can't stand the stuff that most men's groups do. Like I'm not into sports. I'm not into all these things. I feel out of place in men's group. And that surprised me in the beginning before I heard it a number of times. It surprised me a little bit because I thought, oh, it's someone who dealt with the kind of stuff that I dealt with. It doesn't feel comfortable in men's groups. And what I've realized over the years is there's a significant portion, not the majority, but there's a significant portion of guys who don't fit into the kind of stereotypical gym rat or, loves climbing, rock climbing, or do whatever. They're more, even if they're not dealing with anything in the LGBT space, they're just not into that stuff. And so one of the things I'm wondering now, let me just also preface and say, or say that I think it's really important for guys like me who come out of my background, or guys who maybe aren't naturally drawn towards sports or some of these other things. I think we need to lean into not just rejecting some of these other stereotypical kind of masculine things, but we need to kind of explore that. We feel uncomfortable. We are going to be quick to maybe feel ashamed if we're not going to be as good probably as everybody else. But it's still, I think, important that we actually practice and allow ourselves to kind of be exposed to some of these things that tend to make us feel uncomfortable, and just be with the men who are doing those kinds of things and do our best in the process. What I found is that oftentimes guys, especially if they have any kind of training or awareness, they want to be encouraging. They don't want to rip on you. They don't want to, there's always those guys that do that, but they want to be encouragers of guys like me who don't really know what they're doing or feel uncomfortable or quick to feel shame. But my broader question is, in the work that you do you have a view and an eye out for those guys who don't feel strengthened or emboldened or encouraged by doing those again, more stereotypically masculine things, do you have how do you capture those guys and draw them into men's ministry when they feel like, oh, it's just going to be another one of those kind of events?
Yeah, I
Do you know
think.
what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think your team has got to design a program or a men's ministry that's going to reach across the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important for a pastor or a leader of a team for men's ministry to understand that and make that clear to everybody that we're trying to reach all the men. And that will mean we're going to diversify a lot of different opportunities so we can gather those guys in. So it's helpful when they're in marriage settings to have that father son time where they
Yep.
can go, because that they'll meet other kids and they'll meet other dads, and it breaks down some of the barriers. So that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing, and then design a whole program or what you're going to do throughout that considers all the elements of men that you have, the diversity of men you have, and try to. This is why I think it's a difficult ministry, in the sense that we're talking about you have to have integrity in your leadership group. They have to be courageous to
Yeah.
do more than just appeal to a certain element.
Mm-hmm.
They need to persist. They need to be optimistic. They need to be generous, and they need to do things that are excellent for the people, whether it's a father-daughter banquet, which we've done those,
Right.
or something with their son. Uh, there's just a lot that needs to be handled, and we got to forget about we're all in one body. We're all going to the same heaven. So let's make sure
Mm-hmm.
we include all the guys, and that
Yep.
inclusiveness needs to be there for sure. And that
Yep.
starts with the leadership team, and should develop throughout the rest of the program if they continue to make
Yeah, and I
that a
think
part.
based on what you just said, in a way, this um, is obvious and shouldn't necessarily have to be spoken. But I think let me just say this: that in addition to trying to develop a kind of a wide range of activities or interests that will capture not just kind of one group of guys,
Yeah,
but a wide range of different men. Also, in sometimes I feel like ministries have tried to do that, but then when it comes to communicating or inviting or standing up in front of church and doing an announcement or doing some kind of a video or whatever, or even an email kind of communicating it, they leave the reality that, hey, we've really worked hard to, we know that every man is not a cookie cutter, of every other
yeah,
guy, and not every man is a gym rat. And so we certainly have something for those guys that love that kind of thing, but we also really want, you're a man, you're not some subset of the male population. We need you, you need us, and we want to join together. And we've worked really hard to bring something that is going to be inclusive and inviting and helpful, enriching to a wide range of guys. And
right.
so I think sometimes in the communication, even when they've made efforts to do that, sometimes that's completely missing, and a guy just
Yeah,
assumes, oh, it's just going to be one of those, one of
right,
those events again. So
right. But
but I love everything you shared.
I think the other
And
thing, let me
Richard, what
just,
you talked about. Oh, go ahead.
one other thing is just that um, they need to set the tenor. I mean, for what they're doing, and
Yes.
there are. It's great to just sit down and talk, and
Right.
to find out what would be of help. And I know that a lot of guys like to just go out and help somebody,
Yep.
or a group of guys go out and clear some area, territory, or
Hmm.
cut down some trees or whatever, and help some elderly.
Right.
So there's all kinds of ministry opportunity if we just put our to heads together and make sure that we're trying to touch all the bases.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, certainly, I have a real heart and burden for guys to experience a sense of joy about who they are as men made in God's image. And we're living certainly in, I believe, in a culture that right now in this time frame, just from a layman's perspective, but as one who certainly reads up on and stays up on not just issues of sexuality and identity, but also just our misogyny and the devaluing of the feminine, and in
Yeah.
misandry, the devaluing and the hatred of the masculine. It seems like we're living in a time that where there's, I think, misogyny, the devaluing of the feminine, that's still an issue today, obviously, in many places and across the globe, and even in our country. But I feel like the tables have kind of turned in some ways because of historic misogyny, and now there's a lot of misandry. There's a lot of devaluing of the masculine. Everything. Okay, that's too strong of a word. Many things that I believe are simply characteristics of strong men, decisive men, gets lumped under this banner of toxic masculinity, which is there such a thing as toxic masculinity? Yeah, it's actually called sin. And is there
Yeah.
such a thing as toxic femininity? Yes, it's called sin. And
Hmm.
so guys don't bear this toxic nature uniquely in humanity. It's something that
Right.
we share as male and female, as men and women. And certainly I think we're living in a time now where young men, especially, where boys and young men are pushed more and more to be feminized versions of boys or men, and in a culture that doesn't value or promote or strengthen the good aspects of what masculine strength and characteristics even look like. So I think we as a church, the church needs to really reclaim the good of both
Right.
femininity and masculinity, of what it means to be male made in God's image. What does it look like to be female made in God's image? And I'm not talking about roles, but there's a way that we live out femininity and where women live that out. And and that's a spectrum of what that looks
Yeah.
like in terms of being female, and the unique personality that a child is born with, a girl is born with, and grows into womanhood with. There's obviously a range of what it means to be feminine, and there's a range of what it is to be
Yeah.
masculine. And I think that we need to understand that in the body. But that doesn't, when I say that there's this range, I'm not saying that by any stretch that, like, moving from kind of the stereotypical masculine identity. By the way, the cultural stereotypical masculine or feminine identity is oftentimes completely at odds with biblical identity,
Yeah.
for male and female.
I
It's
agree.
not that the one does not equal the other.
Yeah.
But certainly within this range of what God created and blessed within this expression of masculinity, then we have, the LGBT world and the LGBT space, which doesn't represent any of that well. It doesn't mean that there's wonderful people in that space. There are kind women, kind men, really wonderful. Frankly, I've known some kinder people in that space sometimes than I've
Yeah.
found in the church at times. But that's not something we should be promoting or blessing, this embrace of this broken identity that is being born out. But rather, how can I as a guy, like, I was so blessed in the church that I was on staff with for 12 years. It was the church that I was married in. My wife and I have been married for a little over 16 years now. And the men, I was just talking with somebody recently last night about they came to our wedding, and they were commenting on the guys that were there in my as part of my groomsmen, and some of them were real jocks. I mean, really strong guys that knew my story, and it was through their acceptance of me and love of me, not the blessing of my past life, but their acceptance of me as a person, that began to help me grow as a man, began to help me, this dormant seed of masculinity that was I was always looking for masculinity out here in another guy in a way that was never going to be blessed by God or bless me ultimately. And it was through their relationship and fellowship and accountability and just this genuine nature over the course of years of time that I was able to stand and be in this place of becoming a husband to my wife. And there's been lots of growth since then, but to get me to that place where this was actually a good thing to step into instead of
Yeah.
this horrendously fearful thing that I wanted nothing to do with. It was through those relationships that God really reformed, uh, and and called out the good of the masculine. And so the power of that and these guys weren't PhDs in human sexuality. I mean, they had no idea, in a sense, what to do with the guy that was involved in homosexuality for many years and identified in that space. But all they knew to do was to crack their lives open, share their walk with Jesus, share their walk with one another, and be willing to treat me like I was just another guy.
Yeah.
Yep. With some unique things that they didn't fully understand, but they loved me and cared for me. And God used that over the course of time to radically transform my life. And I'm still in that transformation process. It's not over, but man, did he propel me forward through those relationships with men. Is there anything you want to kind of springboard off of in regard to that?
Well, I'm just thinking that, it doesn't matter the variety that where each person is on the spectrum, but this story has come to me as I read through Noah's whole thing. God says three things about Noah. He says he walked with God, he obeyed, and he worshiped. He worshiped when he came out. And I think that if every man could just get a handle on those specific things and walk with God, there has to be a little bit more understanding of what that really means, because that's the deep part. Obeying is the part where you're not saying, hey, I'm independent. I'm a guy. I'm supposed to be independent. You're supposed to be interdependent. That's the third phrase: dependent, independent, interdependent. And so obeying is okay. In fact, it's a great thing, especially because God doesn't lead you down a tunnel or a dark space. So walk with God, obey God, and then worship him. And that's the tough part for guys. They don't know how to do that. But that's the bulk of it for any man. If he can do those three things, he's on his way to maturity.
And also, just to that triangle idea that you pointed out earlier, doing those three things, but doing it in connection in community with our brothers, right?
Community.
And obviously with our sisters and our spouse, what have you. So
Absolutely.
I'm just so grateful, Richard, for all that you've shared with us. I would love, before we wrap up, how can people get in touch with you, whether it's through a website or some other way of contacting you or finding your books or materials? What's the best way of going about that?
Well, they can just email me at rmatteson, Matteson, realty, REALTY, rmattisonrealty@gmail.com. I'd be glad to talk to them, and we can tell them where they can get the book. I have some here, but they're also sold on Amazon, but
okay,
they're there too for right now.
Good. Well, that's great, and we'll make sure we include that information in some kind of a written form here in this podcast as well for those that are viewing it. And yeah, I mean, I just appreciate your wisdom, your counsel, and your passion for ministry to men and the work you're doing in the church to help in this process. And it sounds like the surveys that you're talking about would just be so incredibly helpful, especially for any man that has a desire to walk in this space of wanting to help others. Obviously, the surveys would be great for any of us just wanting to know ourselves better and from that perspective and receive personal help, but also to take that into our sessions, our times of walking with other guys and utilizing those surveys. So are those surveys something that's available online, or how are those surveys
assessments
administered?
I have those assessments, and we've been making them better and better. And I can send you a set so you can just take a look at them, and if you can help us in any way with some of the questions or the statements, that would be great. I've used them for about 20 years, and the reason I chose to have a piece of paper out in front of them is because, when you talk about buying a home and anything, you don't want to get mad at the people. You want to get mad at the process where you're working on that piece of paper. And the same thing's true with men. I can accept and love and care for a guy, but I can still say, okay, well, this is where you've graded yourself. So it's the paper that they're arguing against, or whatever it is that they're doing.
Right.
Not me.
Right.
So it's really helpful.
Yeah, that is helpful. Well, listen, we are so grateful, Richard, that you were here. We're also grateful to our audience, to those that are listening in, watching our podcast, whether, again, you tuned in through Love and Truth Network or Transforming Congregations. We're grateful you were here. We hope that you picked up some things that could be helpful, encouraging to you, maybe informative in your ministry to men, or in some of the areas where you need some personal help and care as a man following Christ and walking with him. So, please tune in again in the future for another one of our podcasts. We so appreciate the time you've just invested with us in our Transforming Congregations podcast. To join us for future podcasts, dial into transformingcongregations.org/podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in a future podcast.